Sometimes the mountain takes what it needs, and sometimes it gives back what we think we've lost. High in the Cascade wilderness, where ancient Douglas firs scrape the belly of winter clouds, Ezra Blackthorne had learned to live with silence. 5 years of hermit life had taught him that solitude was both punishment and medicine, a daily dose of penance for the day he couldn't save his boy from the white death that came roaring down the mountainside. But yesterday something changed. Yesterday he found a child frozen solid in the snow, a boy with his son's face and impossible breath still misting from blue lips. Today, as dawn breaks over his isolated cabin, Ezra peers through frost-covered windows at a sight that defies every law of nature he learned in 20 years as a park ranger. 200 wolves, maybe more, form perfect circles around his home. They don't pace or prowl or show their teeth. They simply sit in the snow, amber eyes fixed on his door, as if they're waiting for an invitation, or perhaps delivering one. The boy he rescued sleeps peacefully by the fire, whispering words in his dreams about debts and covenants and things that should stay buried. What price had Ezra unknowingly paid to pull this child from winter's grip? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light filtering through the frost-etched windows cast everything in an ethereal blue-white glow that reminded Ezra too much of death. He pressed his palm against the cold glass, breath fogging the pain as he counted the wolves again. 203 by his best estimate, maybe 204. In 20 years of ranging these mountains, he'd never seen more than a dozen wolves together, and that was only during the harshest winters when desperation drove them to hunt in larger packs. These weren't desperate. They sat with the patience of stones, some grooming themselves, others simply breathing visible puffs into the frigid air. A few had even curled up to nap in the snow, but their ears remained pricked, alert, waiting. Behind him, the boy stirred by the fireplace, murmuring something that sounded like the silver path before settling back into deep sleep. Ezra turned to study the child's face in the dancing firelight, the same stubborn cowlick that had driven Sarah to distraction every morning, the same small scar above the left eyebrow from a tumble off the porch when he was 4. But Tommy had been 8 when the avalanche took him, and this boy looked no older than 6 or 7. Coincidence, Ezra told himself, though the word felt hollow even in his own mind. The mountains were full of coincidences, rock formations that looked like faces, wind patterns that sounded like voices, shadows that moved like ghosts. A man could lose himself in the search for meaning where none existed. He'd found the boy yesterday afternoon during the worst blizzard to hit the Cascades in 3 years. Ezra had been checking his snare lines when he spotted what looked like a fallen log half buried in a drift near Widow's Creek. Something about the shape nagged at him, and when he'd brushed away the snow, he'd uncovered a child frozen solid as granite, skin blue, white as glacier ice, clothes that belonged to a different century, wool knickers, a rough spun shirt, boots that looked hand-cobbled. Any reasonable person would have known the boy was dead. Should have been dead. The temperature had dropped to 15 below during the night, and the child couldn't have been wearing those thin clothes for more than a few hours without succumbing to hypothermia. But when Ezra had leaned close to check for signs of life, he'd felt the impossibly faint whisper of breath against his cheek. The trek back to the cabin had taken nearly 2 hours through thigh-deep snow, the boy's frozen form cradled in Ezra's arms like a bundle of kindling. He'd stripped the child's icy clothes, wrapped him in wool blankets, and positioned him by the fire, rubbing circulation back into the small hands and feet while checking repeatedly for frostbite. None. Not even the characteristic waxy paleness that preceded tissue death. The boy had awakened near midnight, eyes focusing on Ezra with startling clarity for someone who should have been hypothermic and disoriented. "You shouldn't have brought me back," had been his first words, spoken in a voice like wind through pine needles. "Back from where?" Ezra had asked. The deep cold, the waiting place. The boy had pulled the blankets tighter around his small shoulders. "Now they'll come looking. Who will come looking?" But the child had only stared at the fire, and whispered something about old promises and prices that carried forward through blood. Now, watching the wolf pack maintain their vigil in the growing daylight, Ezra wondered if he should have left the boy where he'd found him. The thought made his chest tighten with familiar guilt, the same crushing weight he'd carried since failing to reach Tommy before the avalanche swept him away. He'd replayed that day 1,000 times, searching for the moment he could have acted differently, moved faster, called out sooner. The boy by the fire shifted again, this time sitting up, small hands rubbing sleep from eyes that seemed far older than his apparent age. "They're still here," he said without looking toward the windows. "You can see them?" "I can feel them." 200 voices all singing the same song. The boy's gaze found Ezra's. "They're not here for me, they're here for you." A chill that had nothing to do with the mountain cold crawled up Ezra's spine. "What do they want?" "To understand what you've done, what you've undone." The boy stood, blankets falling away to reveal pale skin unmarked by yesterday's ordeal. "The mountain remembers everything, Mr. Blackthorne. Every footprint, every breath, every choice that changes the pattern of what should be." Ezra's blood turned to ice water. He'd never told the boy his name. Outside, as if responding to some unheard signal, every wolf in the pack raised its muzzle skyward and began to howl. Not the wild, chaotic chorus he'd heard countless times before, but something structured, almost musical. A song of summoning that echoed off the mountain faces and seemed to vibrate in his very bones. The boy smiled sadly. "They're calling you, Ezra. The question is, are you ready to answer?" The howling ceased as abruptly as it had begun, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt like cotton stuffed in Ezra's ears. He stood frozen at the window, one hand still pressed against the cold glass, trying to process what the boy had just revealed. His name. The child knew his name, though Ezra was certain he'd never spoken it aloud. "How do you know who you are?" The boy pulled the blanket around his shoulders like a shawl, moving to the kitchen table with the careful precision of someone much older. "The mountain whispers many things. Your grief is the loudest sound for miles." Ezra turned from the window, studying the child's face in the morning light. The resemblance to Tommy was unsettling, not just the features, but the mannerisms, the way he tilted his head when thinking, the unconscious habit of worrying his lower lip. Sarah used to tease Tommy about that nervous tic. "You need to eat something," Ezra said, falling back on the familiar rhythm of caretaking that had sustained him through 2 decades of guiding lost hikers and tending wounded animals. "When's the last time you had food?" The boy considered this with the gravity of a philosopher contemplating existence. Time moves differently in the waiting place. Days feel like years, years like heartbeats. Ezra opened a can of soup, chicken and stars, Tommy's favorite, and set it on the wood-burning stove. The mundane action helped ground him, pulling him back from the edge of whatever impossible thing was happening here. This was his routine. This was real. Heat soup, check the weather radio, maintain the fire. These were the bones of his days now, stripped of everything that had once given his life meaning. The ranger station in Granite Falls expected him to check in every 3 days during winter months. His last contact had been Tuesday. Yesterday felt like a week ago, which meant he had 48 hours before anyone came looking. Not that they could reach him in this weather. The access road was impassable from December through March, and the nearest neighbor was 27 miles through terrain that would challenge an experienced mountaineer. Which raised the question of how a small boy in century-old clothes had ended up frozen in a snowdrift on Ezra's mountain. "Where are your parents?" he asked, stirring the soup. "Gone ahead," the boy said simply. "Waiting on the other side of the veil." "Dead, then." Ezra felt a familiar ache in his chest, the same hollow sensation he'd experienced when breaking news to families that their loved ones wouldn't be coming home from the mountains. He'd delivered that message 17 times during his career, and each conversation had carved away another piece of his faith in happy endings. "How long have you been on your own?" "Since the covenant was broken." The boy traced patterns on the table's scarred surface. "Since the balance shifted and the guardians forgot their purpose." Ezra ladled soup into a bowl, added crackers he'd baked from his dwindling flour stores. The boy ate with mechanical efficiency, as if nutrition were a necessary but joyless process. Outside, the wolves had settled into their vigil again, some standing sentinel while others rested in the snow. Their presence should have terrified him. Instead, he found their stillness oddly comforting, like having an honor guard of the mountain itself. This cabin had been his sanctuary for 5 winters, ever since the day he'd watched his son disappear under 10,000 tons of snow and ice. He'd built it himself from timber logged on the property, chinked the gaps with moss and clay, installed solar panels for minimal electricity and a hand pump for the well, everything he needed to survive indefinitely without human contact. The isolation had been intentional. After the avalanche, after the funeral with its parade of well-meaning platitudes, after Sarah had packed her bags and driven away because she couldn't look at him without seeing the father who'd failed to save their child, Ezra had needed distance from a world that expected him to heal, to move on, to accept that sometimes terrible things happened for no reason at all. Here, surrounded by the same peaks that had claimed Tommy, he could maintain the fiction that his son was simply elsewhere, exploring the high meadows, building snow forts, chasing marmots through the alpine grass. Here, he could tend the graves of the past without judgment or timeline. The boy finished his soup and looked up with those 2 old eyes. "You've been waiting for him to come back." It wasn't a question. Ezra felt his carefully constructed defenses crumble like rotted wood. Every parent waits, even when they know better. And if he could come back, if the mountain offered you that gift? The boy's voice carried weight beyond his apparent years. "What price would you pay?" Through the window, Ezra could see the wolves beginning to stir, repositioning themselves in patterns that suggested purpose rather than mere waiting. The morning sun caught their amber eyes, creating points of light that pulsed like stars. His heart hammered against his ribs as possibility and terror warred in his chest. Because deep down, in the place where hope lived despite reason, he already knew his answer. "Everything," Ezra whispered, the word escaping before his rational mind could stop it. The admission hung in the air like a physical presence, and he watched the boy's expression shift from questioning to something that might have been pity. Outside, the wolves rose as one, a coordinated movement that defied natural behavior. They formed concentric circles around the cabin, their amber eyes fixed on the windows with an intensity that made Ezra's skin crawl. The morning light seemed to dim, though no clouds had crossed the sun. "Be careful what you offer," the boy said softly. "The mountain listens to desperate fathers, and it remembers every word." The temperature in the cabin dropped suddenly, enough that their breath became visible. Frost began forming on the inside of the windows, delicate patterns that looked almost like writing in a language Ezra didn't recognize. The fire in the hearth guttered and flared, casting wild shadows that moved independently of the flames. Then he heard it, a sound that shouldn't exist, couldn't exist. Tommy's voice calling from somewhere outside the cabin. "Dad? Dad, where are you?" Ezra's blood turned to ice. He lunged toward the door, but the boy caught his wrist with surprising strength. Those small fingers felt like iron bands, cold enough to burn. "It's not him," the child said urgently. "Not yet. It's the mountain testing your resolve, showing you what could be." "Dad!" The voice came again, closer now, carrying the particular note of fear that had haunted Ezra's dreams for 5 years. The terror of a small boy lost in the snow, calling for help that would never come. Ezra jerked free from the boy's grip and threw open the door. The wall of cold hit him like a physical blow, but he pushed through it, stepping onto the porch. The wolves didn't move, didn't even acknowledge his presence, but he could feel their attention like a weight against his chest. "Tommy?" His voice cracked on the name. The forest gave back only silence. No footprints marked the pristine snow between the cabin and the tree line. The voice had been so clear, so real, that Ezra's hands shook as he gripped the porch railing. Behind him, the boy appeared in the doorway. "The veil is thin here, has been since the day you lost him. Your grief carved a wound in the fabric of things. You're talking about magic." Ezra turned back toward the cabin, each word feeling foreign on his tongue. Impossible things. You pulled me from the deep cold yesterday. A child frozen solid, dead by any measure that matters. The boy's breath formed crystalline clouds in the frigid air. What's impossible about that? Ezra had no answer. He'd been operating on pure instinct since finding the child, not allowing himself to examine too closely the impossibility of the situation. But now, with wolves watching and voices calling from empty forests, denial felt like a luxury he could no longer afford. "What are you?" he asked. "I'm what remains when the covenant breaks. A fragment of what was, caught between what is and what might be." The boy stepped aside to let Ezra back into the cabin. "But you, Ezra Blackthorne, you're something more dangerous. You're a father who refuses to let go." The wolves outside began moving again, their circles tightening around the cabin. Through the frosted windows, Ezra could see their formation shifting into something that looked almost ritualistic. "Ancient. The Guardians are preparing," the boy said, settling back by the fire. "They can sense what's coming. Which is a choice that will echo through generations." The child's eyes reflected the firelight like mirrors. "The mountain is offering you what every grieving parent dreams of, the chance to undo the worst day of your life. But the price?" He trailed off, staring into the flames as if reading prophecy in their dance. "What price?" Ezra demanded. "The natural order exists for a reason. Death feeds life. Endings make space for beginnings. To bring back one who's crossed over requires a tear in that pattern." The boy looked up with ancient sadness. "Others would pay for your miracle, Ezra. Innocent others." Through the windows the wolf song began again, not howling this time, but something lower, more primal. A sound that seemed to rise from the earth itself, vibrating through the cabin's floorboards and into Ezra's bones. He thought of Tommy laughing as they built snowmen, of small hands learning to tie fishing lures, of bedtime stories read by lamplight. He thought of the avalanche's roar and his own helpless screaming as the snow swallowed his son. He thought of Sarah's face the day she left, hollow with grief he couldn't heal. "How long do I have to decide?" he asked. The boy smiled sadly. "Until the moon rises full tomorrow night. That's when the veil will be thinnest, when the crossing could be made." He paused, studying Ezra's face. "But know this. Once you choose, there's no going back. The mountain keeps all debts." Outside, 200 wolves sang their ancient song, and somewhere in the harmony, Ezra could swear he heard his son calling his name. Sleep wouldn't come. Ezra lay on his narrow cot, staring at ceiling beams he'd hewn himself from Douglas fir, while the boy's words echoed in his mind like a curse. "Others would pay for your miracle. Innocent others." The fire had burned low, casting the cabin in amber shadows that seemed to writhe and dance with their own malevolent life. Outside, the wolves maintained their vigil in absolute silence. No shuffling, no panting, nothing but the occasional creak of snow beneath a shifting paw. Their presence felt like a physical weight pressing down on the cabin. He'd built this place to escape the weight of his failures, but now those failures seemed to seep from the very walls. Every corner held memories of Tommy, the fishing rod still propped by the door from their last trip together, the half-finished chess set Ezra had been carving as a Christmas surprise, the small boots still sitting by the hearth where his son had left them that final morning. What if it's not really Tommy they're offering? The thought struck him like ice water. What if this was some elaborate trick of grief and isolation, his mind finally snapping after 5 years of self-imposed exile? Mountain madness was real. He'd seen it in hikers who'd spent too long above the tree line, their judgment eroded by altitude and solitude until they made decisions that killed them. But the boy by the fire was no hallucination. Ezra had touched him, fed him, watched him eat with mechanical precision that belonged to no child who'd ever lived. And those eyes, ancient, weary eyes in a face that wore Tommy's features like an ill-fitting mask. The wind picked up, howling through the peaks with a sound that might have been laughter or screaming. Snow pelted the windows like thrown rice, and somewhere in the storm's voice, Ezra heard echoes of that terrible day 5 years ago. They'd been tracking elk sign in the high country when the weather turned. What had started as light flurries became a whiteout in minutes, and Ezra had made the fatal decision to push for the emergency shelter rather than hunker down where they were. Tommy had been tired, stumbling in snow up to his waist, but he'd trusted his father completely, even when the mountain began to groan around them, even when the first warning rumbles shook loose stones from the cliffs above. Tommy had kept following in Ezra's footsteps without question. The avalanche had taken less than 30 seconds to bury everything. 30 seconds to erase 8 years of bedtime stories and scraped knees and proud moments at school plays. Ezra had dug with his bare hands until they bled, screaming Tommy's name until his voice gave out. But the snow had already done its work. They'd found the boy's body 3 days later when the rescue teams finally reached them. Peaceful, they'd said, as if that made any difference. As if peaceful dead was somehow better than terrified dead. Sarah had blamed him, though she'd never said it outright. The accusation lived in her silences, in the way she'd stopped meeting his eyes, in how she'd flinched whenever he tried to touch her. You were supposed to protect him, her body language said. That was your job. And you failed. She'd been right, of course. It had been his job, and he had failed spectacularly. Now the mountain was offering him redemption, and the price was someone else's child. Someone else's family destroyed, so his could be made whole. The arithmetic of it made him sick, trading innocent lives for his own selfish need to undo his mistakes. But God, he wanted his son back. The wanting was a physical ache in his chest, a hunger that had grown stronger rather than weaker with each passing year. He wanted to hear Tommy's laugh again, wanted to finish teaching him to fly fish, wanted to see what kind of man his boy would have become. "You're thinking too hard," the boy said from across the room. Ezra hadn't heard him wake. Grief makes everything seem more complicated than it is. Murder usually is complicated. Ezra sat up on the cot, studying that familiar profile in the dying firelight. Because that's what you're talking about, isn't it? Other people have to die. Death and life are part of the same cycle. The mountain doesn't see them as separate things. The boy turned toward him, and for a moment his features shifted, becoming less Tommy-like and more something else entirely, something older and infinitely sadder. What matters is whether you're strong enough to live with your choice. And if I say no, then you continue as you have, alone with your ghosts, waiting for a peace that will never come. The boy's voice carried the weight of prophecy. The wolves will leave, the veil will close, and this chance will never come again. Outside, as if summoned by the conversation, the pack began to stir. Through the windows, Ezra could see them repositioning themselves, their formation growing tighter around the cabin. The moon hung full and bloated above the peaks, casting everything in silver light that made the world look brittle as ice. 24 hours. That's all the time he had left to decide whether love was worth damnation. Ezra stared at the boy's transformed features, ancient, inhuman, yet still wearing enough of Tommy's face to make his heart clench. The moonlight streaming through the frost-covered windows cast everything in silver relief, and he could feel the weight of 24 hours pressing down on him like the mountain itself. "Show me," he said quietly. The boy tilted his head with that familiar gesture that belonged entirely to Tommy. "Show you what?" "How it works. What happens to them, the innocent others." Ezra's voice was steady, but his hands shook as he reached for his boots. "If I'm going to damn myself, I need to know exactly what I'm choosing." Something shifted in the boy's expression. Surprise, perhaps, or respect. "You want to see the price before you pay it. I want to understand what I'm becoming." The boy rose from his place by the dying fire, and as he stood, his form seemed to flicker between Tommy's familiar shape and something else, something that cast shadows too long and dark for the moonlight to explain. "The mountain will show you, but once you see, you can't unknow it. The weight of that knowledge becomes part of the choice. Then it's part of the choice I need to make." Outside, the wolves began moving with purpose, their formation shifting from circles to lines that stretched away from the cabin toward the tree line. Their amber eyes reflected the moonlight like lanterns, creating paths of light that led deeper into the forest. "They're waiting for us," the boy said. Ezra pulled on his winter gear with hands that moved automatically through familiar motions: thermal layers, wool socks, insulated boots, the heavy coat that had kept him alive through 5 winters of isolation. Each piece of clothing felt like armor against what was coming, though he knew no amount of preparation could protect him from what he was about to see. The boy watched him dress without moving to find any gear of his own. When Ezra reached for a spare coat, the child shook his head. "The cold can't touch what I am now," he said simply. Ezra opened the cabin door and stepped into the night. The temperature hit him like a physical blow, 30 below, maybe colder, with a wind that turned the air into crystalline knives. But the wolves parted before them like water, creating a corridor that led toward the high peaks where Tommy had died. His breath came in sharp puffs that froze before they could dissipate. The snow crunched beneath his boots, with the particular sound that only came in the deepest cold, when each step broke through ice crystals that had grown sharp as broken glass. Behind him, the boy's footsteps made no sound at all. They climbed through stands of Douglas fir and lodgepole pine, following game trails that Ezra had walked 1,000 times during his years as a ranger. But tonight, the familiar landscape felt alien, transformed by moonlight and the presence of the pack that flowed around them like a living river. The wolves moved without sound, their paws finding purchase on ice that would have sent a human tumbling into the ravine below. "How far?" Ezra asked, his words stolen by the wind almost before he could speak them. "To the place where the veil is thinnest, where your grief carved the deepest wound." The boy's voice carried clearly despite the storm, as if the wind bent around his words. "Where your son crossed over, the avalanche site." Of course it would be there. They climbed for what felt like hours, though the moon never seemed to move across the sky. Time flowed strangely here, thick as honey, stretching moments into eternities. Ezra's legs burned with the effort of breaking trail through snow that reached past his knees, but he pushed forward, driven by a need that went deeper than curiosity. He was crossing a threshold he'd avoided for 5 years, returning to the place where his world had ended. Every step took him further from the safety of his cabin, from the comfortable numbness of isolation, into territory where the rules he'd lived by no longer applied. The wolves began to sing as they climbed, not howling but something older and more complex, a harmony that seemed to rise from the mountain itself. The sound vibrated through his bones, through the very stone beneath the snow, until Ezra felt like he was walking through the body of some vast, sleeping creature. Finally, they crested a ridge that opened into a wide bowl, surrounded by towering peaks. Ezra recognized it immediately, the place where he'd made his fatal decision to push for shelter, where the mountain had claimed his son. But the landscape had been transformed into something that belonged more to dream than memory. The snow glowed with its own inner light, and hanging in the air above the bowl were shapes that hurt to look at directly, glimpses of other places, other times, connected to this spot by threads of silver that pulsed like veins. "The tears in the world," the boy said softly. "Every life taken out of turn, every death that feeds the crossing. See how they ripple outward, how each choice echoes through families, through generations." And Ezra could see. The price of his miracle stretched across time like a spider's web, touching lives he would never meet. Children who would die so his child could live. But he was already walking toward the center of the bowl, toward the tear that would bring Tommy home. There was no going back now. The luminous tears hung before Ezra like windows into hell. Through one silvery rift, he watched a father in Detroit carry his daughter's small body from a car wreck that wouldn't happen for 3 years. Through another, a mother in rural Montana screamed over a hospital bed where her son fought a losing battle against pneumonia. The images shifted and blurred, showing him glimpses of tragedies that would cascade through time if he chose to tear his own child from death's grasp. "Stop," he whispered, but the visions kept coming. A family camping trip in Oregon, 2029. A little girl, maybe 6 years old, swept away by rapids that should have been calm. Her parents' anguish echoed across the ethereal space, mixing with dozens of other voices in a symphony of loss that made Ezra's knees buckle. "Every restoration requires destruction," the boy said, his voice carrying a weight that belonged to something far older than Tommy had ever been. "The universe seeks balance. Take a life from one side of the scales, and something must fall from the other." "How many?" Ezra forced himself to stand, though the weight of future suffering pressed down on him like an avalanche. "How many children die for mine?" "Number varies. The mountain chooses according to laws we don't understand." The boy moved closer, his footsteps still leaving no mark in the glowing snow. Sometimes one, sometimes dozens, depending on the strength of the connection, the depth of the wound your grief carved. Through the tears, Ezra saw a pattern beginning to emerge. Each tragedy was connected to this moment, to this choice, by threads of consequence that stretched across years. A missed phone call here, a delayed flight there, 1,000 tiny adjustments to the world's fabric that would funnel innocent families toward disaster. But then something else stepped into the bowl, a figure made of shadow and starlight, wearing the face of his dead son like a mask that didn't quite fit. Not the boy who'd been traveling with them, but something else entirely. Something that moved with predatory grace across the luminous snow. "Dad?" It spoke with Tommy's voice, but wrong somehow, like an echo played backward. "I've been waiting for you to come back." Ezra's heart clenched with desperate recognition, even as every instinct screamed warnings. This wasn't his son, couldn't be his son, but the resemblance was perfect down to the gap between his front teeth and the cowlick that had never stayed flat, no matter how much Sarah fussed with it. "Tommy?" He took a step forward, then stopped as the boy beside him grabbed his arm. "Don't," the child warned urgently. "That's not what you think it is." The shadow thing wearing Tommy's face smiled with too many teeth. "He brought me back once already, didn't you, Dad? The day you found this one frozen in the snow." It gestured toward Ezra's companion. Every act of resurrection calls to what was lost. "Your grief has been singing across the vale for 5 years, and I finally heard you." Around the bull's perimeter, the wolves began moving again, their formation shifting into something that looked almost defensive. Their amber eyes tracked the shadow Tommy as it circled closer, and Ezra could hear low growls building in their chests. "The Guardians know what this is," his companion said quietly. "They've seen it before. Grief given form, loss wearing the shape of love. It feeds on the space between what was and what should have been. I don't understand." Ezra's breath came in sharp gasps that crystallized immediately in the frigid air. "What does it want?" "To make the crossing complete. If you choose resurrection, it opens a door that can't be closed. This thing, this hunger wearing your son's face, follows the real Tommy back into the world." The boy's grip tightened on Ezra's arm. "It would devour everything you love, starting with the life you're trying to save." The shadow Tommy laughed, and the sound echoed strangely across the bowl, multiplying until it seemed like dozens of children were laughing in the darkness. 5 years I've been growing stronger, feeding on his pain. Do you know how delicious guilt tastes? How it changes flavor when mixed with hope?" Ezra understood then why the wolves had come, why they formed circles around his cabin like guards. They weren't there to help him retrieve his son. They were there to contain something far worse, something his grief had been nurturing without his knowledge. "There's still time to choose differently," his companion said. But Ezra could hear doubt creeping into the child's voice. "The ritual isn't complete. The door isn't fully open." The tears in the world pulsed brighter, showing him more visions, more families destroyed, more children lost to feed his selfish desire to undo the past. But now he could see something else moving through those windows of possibility. Shadow things like the one wearing Tommy's face, slipping through cracks in reality wherever grief ran deep enough. He'd thought the choice was between his son's life and innocent strangers. Now he realized the real question was whether his love was strong enough to damn the entire world. The wolves' growls grew louder as Shadow Tommy danced closer through the luminous snow, and Ezra finally understood why some doors should never be opened. The shadow wearing his son's face circled closer, and Ezra felt the last of his illusions crumble like ice in spring. 5 years of careful self-deception, telling himself he'd accepted Tommy's death, that he'd made peace with his failure as a father, shattered in the space between one heartbeat and the next. He'd never grieved, he'd been feeding something monstrous instead. "You have to choose now," his companion said urgently. The boy's form flickered in the ethereal light, becoming translucent at the edges. "The longer we stay here, the stronger it gets. The veil between worlds grows thinner." Through the tears in reality, more shadows were pressing close, hungry things drawn by the promise of crossing over. Ezra could see them testing the barriers, probing for weaknesses in the cosmic fabric his grief had already worn threadbare. How many other parents had stood in places like this? How many had fed their pain to entities that wore their children's faces? "Sarah," he whispered, understanding flooding through him like ice water. After Tommy's funeral, she'd spoken of dreams where their son visited her, asking why she never came to see him. She'd grown thin, distracted, jumping at sounds that weren't there. He'd blamed her withdrawal on grief, never realizing she might be fighting the same hunger that had been growing in the mountain's shadow. "Your wife saw through its deception," the boy confirmed, reading his thoughts. "She recognized the wrongness. That's why she left, not because she blamed you for Tommy's death, but because staying meant feeding something that would eventually devour her too." The revelation hit him harder than the mountain cold. Sarah hadn't abandoned him. She'd been protecting herself from the shadow thing his unresolved grief was nurturing. How many nights had she lain awake, feeling it scratch at the edges of her dreams? How many times had she bitten back words of comfort because she knew they would only make it stronger? "Choose, Dad." Shadow Tommy's voice was patient now, confident. Around the bowl, more tears were opening, showing glimpses of a world where creatures like it roamed free, feeding on loss until nothing remained but empty husks wearing familiar faces. "Let me come home. Let me make everything right." The wolves' formation tightened, their growls building to a crescendo that shook snow from the surrounding peaks. They weren't just guardians, they were soldiers in a war between worlds, and this battlefield was about to collapse entirely. Ezra looked at his companion, really seeing him for the first time. Not Tommy, not a lost child seeking warmth, but something else entirely. A messenger, perhaps. A guide sent by forces he couldn't comprehend to offer him one last chance at redemption. "What are you?" he asked. "What you might have become if you'd chosen differently 5 years ago." The boy's features shifted, becoming more distinct and less Tommy-like with each passing moment. "I was a father once too. I made the crossing. I brought my daughter home and damned everything I touched in the process." The admission hung between them like a blade. Here was someone who'd chosen resurrection, who'd paid the price Ezra was being offered. The weight of that knowledge settled into his bones, colder than the mountain wind. How many died for her? Ezra forced himself to ask. Hundreds, eventually. The shadow that followed her across fed until it became strong enough to open more tears, to call more of its kind. It took 3 centuries for the Guardians to contain the breach. The boy's voice carried the weight of those years, of choices that echoed through generations. "I've been walking between worlds ever since, trying to prevent others from making the same mistake." Through the tears, in reality, Ezra could see the scope of what his choice would unleash. Not just the immediate casualties, the children who would die to balance his son's return, but the long-term consequences. Shadow things spreading across the world like a plague, wearing the faces of the lost, consuming love and hope until humanity became a hollow echo of itself. Yet Tommy was still out there somewhere, still waiting. His real son, not this hungry phantom, but the boy who'd trusted him completely even as the mountain prepared to claim him. 8 years old forever, suspended in the moment before the avalanche hit, wondering why his father didn't come to find him. "There's another way," he said suddenly, the words torn from him like confession. "If I go back instead, if I take his place." Shadow Tommy snarled, its mask of innocence finally slipping completely. "That's not how it works. The dead stay dead unless the living pay the price." But the boy beside him was nodding slowly, hope flickering in his ancient eyes. "The mountain accepts all debts eventually. A life freely given carries different weight than one taken by force. The wolves fell silent, their amber eyes fixed on Ezra, as if they too were waiting for his decision. In the sudden quiet, he could hear his own heartbeat, feel the weight of 5 years' worth of unfinished conversations with his son pressing against his chest. He was a father. It was time he started acting like one. The words hung in the air between them like a challenge to the universe itself. Ezra felt the mountain listening, felt the weight of cosmic scales preparing to tip in response to his offer. Around the luminous bowl, the tears in reality pulsed with renewed intensity, showing him glimpses of what his sacrifice might mean. But Shadow Tommy wasn't finished. The entity wearing his son's face let out a shriek that shattered the crystalline air, and suddenly the night erupted into chaos. The creature lunged forward, abandoning all pretense of humanity as its form stretched and writhed, becoming something made of smoke and starving need. Where Tommy's gentle brown eyes should have been, Ezra saw endless voids that reflected his own failures back at him. Every bedtime story he'd missed, every soccer game he'd prioritized work over, every moment he'd taken for granted before the mountain claimed them all. "You can't escape what you've fed." The thing's voice multiplied, echoing from every tier in reality as dozens of similar entities pressed against the barriers between worlds. 5 years of guilt, 5 years of feeding me your pain. I am part of you now. The boy beside him moved with impossible speed, placing himself between Ezra and the advancing horror. Light blazed from the child's form, not the cold illumination of the snow, but something warm and fierce that reminded Ezra of campfires and Christmas mornings and all the moments that made life worth living. "The choice is still yours," the boy called over the creature's wails. "But you have to make it now, before—" The shadow thing struck, and Ezra watched in horror as it passed through his companion like he was made of mist. The boy's form flickered, becoming translucent, and suddenly Ezra could see the truth of what he was. Not solid, not real, but something held together by will alone. A spirit who'd been fighting this battle for centuries, growing weaker with each intervention. "I can't hold it much longer," the boy gasped, his features beginning to blur. "The mountain, you have to choose, before the veil tears completely." Around them, the wolves began to change. Their forms stretched upward, becoming more human while retaining their predatory grace. Ezra realized these weren't animals at all, but guardians wearing familiar shapes, beings from the space between worlds, drawn here to contain a breach that threatened everything he'd ever known. One of them, larger than the rest, padded forward on legs that shifted between wolf and man with each step. When it spoke, its voice carried the authority of ancient laws and cosmic balance. Ezra Blackthorne. 5 years ago, your grief carved a wound in reality. Tonight, that wound threatens to consume both worlds. You offered your life in place of your son's. Do you understand what that means? The Shadow Tommy howled behind him, clawing at barriers that were beginning to crack. Through the tears, Ezra could see more entities gathering, a hungry army waiting for the moment the walls fell completely. "I understand," he said, though his voice shook with the magnitude of what he was accepting. "I go back to that day. I take Tommy's place under the avalanche. He lives, I die, and the wound heals because it never had a chance to form." "The timeline fractures," the Guardian warned. "You won't remember this moment, won't remember the choice you made. From your perspective, you'll simply be a father making a split-second decision to save his child. Are you prepared to die without ever knowing why?" Ezra thought of Tommy's laugh, of the way his son's face lit up when they spotted deer on the mountain trails. He thought of Sarah, alone in whatever new life she'd built, carrying scars from his inability to let go. He thought of all the children who would die if he chose resurrection, all the shadows that would follow, them back into a world unprepared for such hunger. "I'm prepared." The shadow thing let out a final desperate shriek and threw itself forward, but it was too late. The guardian wolves moved as one, their forms blazing with protective light as they contained the entity's fury. Around the bowl, the tears in reality began to seal, cutting off the hungry things that pressed against them. But Ezra was no longer watching. The world was dissolving around him, time flowing backward like a river in reverse. He felt himself falling through years, through seasons, through the accumulated weight of grief and isolation, until he stood once again in a different place entirely. Snow was falling. Fresh powder that would make perfect skiing conditions, and perfect avalanche conditions too. Tommy was 8 years old again, cheeks red with cold, eyes bright with excitement as he pointed toward the distant peak where they'd planned to make camp. "Can we go up the East Ridge, Dad? Please? I want to see the view from the top." Ezra looked at the threatening clouds, felt the wind shift in a way that spoke of danger. In another timeline, one that no longer existed, he would push forward, make the choice that doomed them both. This time, he chose differently. "Not today, son. Let's head for shelter instead." The mountain held its breath, waiting to see if love could finally triumph over pride. The mountain's breath released in a thunderous roar that shook the very foundations of reality. Ezra felt the timeline snap back like a rubber band, the careful choice he'd just made unraveling in his hands. Something had gone wrong, terribly, catastrophically wrong. The shelter he'd guided Tommy toward 5 years ago was collapsing, ancient timbers groaning under the weight of snow that shouldn't have been there. "Dad!" Tommy's voice cut through the chaos, high and terrified in a way that pierced Ezra's soul. "Dad, the roof's coming down." Time fractured around them. Ezra lunged forward, throwing himself toward his son, but his feet found no purchase on ground that kept shifting between past and present. He was 42 and 47 simultaneously, watching his careful sacrifice crumble as the cosmic scales rejected his offering. The boy who'd guided him, his companion from the space between worlds, materialized beside them, his form flickering like a dying flame. "The timeline won't hold," he gasped, his ancient eyes wide with something approaching panic. Too much damage, too many years of grief feeding the breach. You can't simply erase what's already been torn. Above them, the shelter's roof beam splintered with a sound like breaking bones. Ezra saw it falling toward Tommy in slow motion, saw his son's face turn upward in confusion, and realized with crystalline horror that he'd traded one death for another. The mountain would claim his boy either way, avalanche or collapse. The destination remained unchanged. "No." The word tore from his throat as he threw himself forward, but his hands passed through Tommy like smoke. He wasn't fully here, wasn't fully anywhere, caught between timelines, between what was and what should have been, powerless to save the child he'd sacrificed everything to protect. The beam struck with finality that echoed across dimensions. Ezra found himself standing in the luminous bowl again, but something fundamental had changed. The tears in reality were spreading, no longer contained by the guardian wolf's protective circle. His failure had weakened the barriers between worlds, and hungry shadows poured through the cracks like water through a broken dam. "You see now," Shadow Tommy said, its voice carrying new strength as it fed on Ezra's fresh despair. "Love isn't enough, hope isn't enough. The universe doesn't care about your good intentions or noble sacrifices. It only understands hunger." The real boy, his guide, his would-be savior, was fading rapidly, his form becoming translucent as the cosmic wound widened. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the chaos. I thought this time would be different. I thought love might finally be enough." Around the bowl's perimeter, the guardian wolves were falling back, their protective light dimming as more entities poured through the breaches. Ezra watched in numb horror as shadows wearing familiar faces emerged from the tears. Children who'd died in car accidents, parents who'd lost battles with cancer, lovers separated by war and circumstance, all of them hungry, all of them seeking the warmth of the living world to fill the cold spaces where their hearts should have been. "This is what you've unleashed," Shadow Tommy continued, its features shifting between his son's innocent face and something far more predatory. "Every parent who's ever stood at a graveside, every spouse who's ever wished for one more day, every child who's ever asked why someone they loved had to go away, they all lead here eventually, and thanks to you, the door is finally open. Ezra sank to his knees in the luminous snow, watching his son's face worn like a mask by something that had never known love, only the echo of it. 5 years of careful grief had led to this moment, and now he understood the true scope of his failure. Not just Tommy's death, but his own inability to let go had doomed countless others to the same hungry emptiness. "Sarah knew," he whispered, the words bitter as winter wind. "She knew what I was becoming." The shadow thing laughed, and the sound multiplied across the broken landscape of reality. "Your wife tried to warn you, didn't she? Those dreams where Tommy visited her, asking why she never came to see him. That was me, learning to use his face, growing stronger on her pain until she had to choose between her sanity and staying close to you." The revelation hit him like an avalanche of its own. Sarah hadn't left because she blamed him for Tommy's death. She'd left because staying meant feeding the very entity that was now preparing to devour everything they'd ever held dear. Her departure hadn't been abandonment. It had been the last desperate act of a mother protecting herself from something that would have consumed her completely. "And now?" Ezra asked, though he already knew the answer. "Now the feast begins," Shadow Tommy replied, gesturing toward the spreading tears. "The living world, so full of loss and longing, so ready to believe that death isn't final, that love conquers all. They'll welcome us with open arms, never realizing we're only wearing the faces of what they've lost." In the distance, Ezra could hear something that chilled him more than the mountain wind. Laughter. Children's laughter, echoing across the broken bowl as hungry shadows prepared to claim dominion over a world that had forgotten how to let go.